are kind of finishing up on our sermon series about who this Jesus character is that we just brought into the world through this birth thing. We spent all of our money celebrating Jesus' birth, went broke, still in debt. So who is this Jesus that's worthy of our debt? And so we're trying to finish this up this week, and so today we're talking about that people are just willing to die when they follow him, just to be able to follow him. And so what kind of a person does this? What kind of person has an impact on people's lives that makes this happen? So we're going to look at the guy named Paul and what he had to say and what he had to do. You know, when we follow the Apostle Paul, when we see his amazing journey of faith, we see a man who was young and living under the law of Moses and growing up to be one of the strongest leaders of all of Israel, who went by another name, the name of Saul at that point. Yet after the death of Jesus, he was so highly respected that he was kind of given the task of putting an end to this movement that was making a mockery of God. It's the followers of the Way that claimed that this man named Jesus was equivalent to God, and that was blasphemy. And so the Way was building momentum, and that created problems, and Saul was sent to fix the problem, right? So on his way to Damascus, another uprising was taking place. He had an experience with the risen Christ in a light. And this experience helped him to understand God's plan in the world a little more fully, but also empowered him to share the good news of God's grace that went to all people. Now, the change of his life and his message was so radical that a change of name took place. He went from Saul to Paul. But what was so powerful about his experience with Christ, that he was willing to change his entire identity? Think about that. Because Paul went from a man of luxury, of power, of standing among his own people, to the bottom of the totem pole, and living each day not even worried or thinking about where his next meal will come from. He went from the hunter to the hunted, to the persecutor to the persecuted. He went from being respected among his peers to being disrespected by his own people. He went from administrating death to facing death without fear. What causes a person to make such a radical shift in lifestyle and values? Because from the outside looking in, it doesn't look too appealing to any of us. Closing on his third missionary journey, Paul was making his way back to Jerusalem when he received unsurprising news. This is his journey. The mother church in Jerusalem felt threatened by Paul's ministry. Therefore, his life had been threatened. And like Jesus, for him to go into Jerusalem would also mean that it could face his death. So hear the story as recorded in the book of Acts. When Paul had finished the voyage from Tyre, we arrived at Ptolemais, and we were greeted the believers, and we stayed with them for one day. The next day, we left. We came to Caesarea. We went into the house of Philip the evangelist, one of the 7, and we stayed with him. He had 4 unmarried daughters who had the gift of prophecy. Man, I'm glad I don't live in that house. I got 3 daughters, and they all think they're prophets. Just a side note. While we were staying there for several days, a prophet named Agabus had come down from Judea, and he came to us and took Paul's belt. And he bound his own hands and his own feet with it, and then he said this, "Thus says the Holy Spirit, This is the way the Jews in Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt and will hand him over to the Gentiles. When we heard this, we and the people there urged Paul not to go up to Jerusalem. But Paul answered, "What are you doing? Weeping, breaking my heart. For I am ready not only to be bound, but even to die in Jerusalem for the name of our Lord Jesus." Since he would not be persuaded, we remained silent except to say, "The Lord's will be done." So after these days, we got ready. We started to go up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea also came along and brought up to the house of Mason of Cyprus an early disciple with whom we were staying. Here ends this reading. The whole purpose of our asking this question is, who is this Jesus? It's just to kind of stop and take pause a little bit to really see Jesus for who he truly is. Because the one thing that we know, it's not unlike today. I think there's a lot of parallels to where Jesus came into the world and in the way the world is today, especially around in our nation, is that he was brought into a world of rules and laws, where the priests and the religious leaders served as the moral police, right? They had been the self-appointed power to place people in eternal timeout, right? And just make a person's life full of misery and condemnation. All this is done in the name of God, of course, which makes it okay. So this representation of God, I think, really bothered God. God was bothered so much that God intervened in the world and appeared in this person of Jesus who gave us a completely different picture of God than the one that was painted by God's people. Imagine that. And so this picture of God is who we have been looking at in this person of Jesus over the past 5 weeks. You know, we've talked about how this God is so easy to understand. It's so easy to grasp. It's simple things like love your God and love your neighbor as you love yourself, and just treat people the way you want to be treated. That's not difficult stuff. It's simple to grasp and understand. We've learned also that God plays multiple roles in the world and in our own lives according to what our personal needs might be at any given time. Counselor, teacher, right? Friend, prophet when we need it. We've learned that God isn't controlled by authoritarians. That Jesus just set his course according to what God called him to do. He listened to authority when authority listens to God. We learn that this God also makes examples of faith out of children, out of the poor, those on the outside of the faith who are very vulnerable but also confess their need for God. We saw that this Jesus is also one who values all people, regardless of their sin, regardless of their place in society, regardless of their reputation, regardless of how they even view themselves. This Jesus saw value in all people. Jesus' actions and character were so different than the church of his day. And Jesus' actions and character are so different from the church of today, which leads us to the question of who is this Jesus? But more importantly, what adjustments do I need to make in my own personal lives, in the things that I value, in my priorities, in my attitude, even our ministries, in order to be able to represent the one whose baptism we took in? I think the greatest obstacle that we must overcome in our faith is that we tend to look at God's kingdom using the same lenses of looking at the world's kingdom. I think we tend to do that. And I can make an illustration by using one shape. And that shape is a triangle, also known as a pyramid. Now on this shape, on this pyramid, people want to be somewhere in this, right? We want to be somewhere in that pyramid. Where do we generally want to be? We love the top, don't we? Sure beats the view from the bottom, doesn't it? We always want to be at the top. So think about this. In the world's economic pyramid, or the world's social pyramid, the world's power pyramid, popularity pyramid, we strive to be on top in order to feel relevant. Where was Jesus on this pyramid? Economically, on the bottom. Socially, on the bottom. Power-wise, in terms of worldly power and popularity, always in the bottom. Who did Jesus use as examples of faith? Examples of mercy, examples of humility and compassion? It's always those at the bottom. Who did Jesus criticize the most for those who lacked faith and mercy and humility and compassion? It's always those on the top. Yet who do we and our children aspire to be? What do we watch on TV? Who are our heroes? Tend to be those who are at the top. And what happens with the church is that we begin to contradict Jesus when we say that God has blessed us to be on top of the economic, social, and powerful and popularity and power pyramid. That's just not true. Because what God does bless us is when we give ourselves, when we share our resources, when we dedicate our lives to the least of those at the bottom part of the pyramid, when we serve those who cannot serve themselves. That's frustrating. That's hard to do. We just spent a long week in Ecuador and talked Tom Porter into going with us this time. And Tom he's my hero. I always told him throughout the week that when I grow up, I want to be just like him. And Tom is an engineer, so you know how he thinks, right? That's all you need to know. And the thing that he kept doing the whole entire week we worked down with these people, he would just turn and go, I got to do my Tom face. Let me get my lips. If these people would just do this and do this and do this, there wouldn't have any problems. I would say 300 times that week, Tom, that's why we're here. It is amazing what people do not know that we know. And that's part of what we do, is that we take care of those who cannot take care of themselves. And the only 3-4 buildings in the whole town of Pursuer that are square and level are the ones that Tom worked on. We had to strip down simple pens that held goats and rebuild them, using only $300 to do so. And every one of those pens, we look back and say, how did we do that? And there was Tom. Something else.
Tom will show you the pictures too.
Yeah. And he'll tell you too that if they just do this and they just do that, then we wouldn't have any problems. That's why we're here, Tom. That's the Christian message. That's the Christian mission. Last week's text, Jesus made another simple statement to the church leaders. The statement was this, and sometimes you get away from this. He says, I want you to go and I want you to learn what it means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. What does it mean that God desires mercy from God's people? For today we live in a world where Christians now have the reputation of replacing the priests and the religious leaders as the moral police. I think the message speaks to us pretty clearly that the time has come again to stop attacking and start trusting God's grace and mercy. The one I read the most is Henry Nouwen, and Henry Nouwen had this to say. It's not enough for us to be a moral people. It's not enough for us to be well trained. It's not enough to us to be eager to help our fellow humans. It's not enough for us to be able to respond creatively to the burning issues of our time. All of these are very valuable and important, but it is not the heart of a Christian. That's not it. The simple question is this: are men and women of God people who have an ardent desire to dwell in God's presence, to listen to God's voice, to look at God's beauty, to touch God's incarnate word, and to taste fully God's infinite goodness? What Henry Nouwen is saying is that morality is for us to use as a compass. It's for us to live by. It's to us to help us keep grounded, and we can make the best out of the life of which we're called to lead. But our actions towards others, that's different. Our actions towards others should never, ever, ever reflect a disgusted nun who uses a ruler to slap the wrist of all those who cross the lines of my morality. Our actions are actions of mercy, always, bottom line. And true actions of mercies only comes from a soul that is cared for, that is immersed in, a soul that is influenced by the grace of God. Mercy loves perfectly, regardless of the person, regardless of the circumstance, regardless of the crime, regardless of the condition. God chooses to love, we therefore choose to love. And once we begin to understand mercy, and once we begin to model mercy with our lives, then we will begin to understand why people such as Paul are so willing to die to follow this Jesus.